I just want to say I'm really proud at AARP for moving forward. I think it's hard for public institutions to change. And I think doing that is not only good for us as an organization, but I think it's good as a model to say, hey, listen, you can bring people under your fold. It doesn't mean that the world is ending. Change can be positive and change can make us all better. And I'm proud to work for an organization that is open to change and to following that up with something meaningful. Asking the questions is great, but to then say, no, we owe something to our group, to our members, and our members are LGBTQ members.
Welcome to Grain Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. You can find complete show notes and additional episodes of Grain Rainbows by going to my website at grainrainbows.com. You can send me email at grainrainbows@gmail.com or leave voice feedback via SpeakPipe at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. Before I tell you about today's guest, I want to give a shout out to Rhodes Perry from The Out Entrepreneur, who I interviewed back in episode 9. Last summer, when Grain Rainbows was still a dream, I talked with Rhodes on the phone, and he not only encouraged me to move forward, but he also gave me some very practical advice. He told me that creating change, which is the big annual meeting of the National LGBTQ Task Force, was a great place to meet people interested in advocacy for older members of our community. He also told me about SAGE, which I knew about, but he surprised me by telling me that AARP is actually a major ally. So I went off to Creating Change this past January when it was held in Detroit. My goal was to find guests for Grain Rainbows, including folks from SAGE and AARP. That's where I met Cheryl Whalen from SAGE, who you met in episode 18. I also met today's guests, Cassandra Contave and Aisha Bonner-Cozad. Cassandra and Aisha work as researchers at AARP. What is AARP? So let's start with the name, which doesn't really appear on their website. AARP used to stand for the American Association for Retired Persons, but several years ago they decided to change the RP to stand for Real Possibilities. If you live in the United States and you are at least 50, you have probably already received an invitation to AARP. AARP is probably the single most powerful advocacy group in the United States for protecting older Americans. I tend to think of them as the guys that try to protect Medicare and Social Security, but I've learned that they do much, much more, including advocacy for LGBT plus elders. Please do listen to the content after this interview because I have several new projects that I want to share with you. Today's interview has a slightly different format because there were 2 guests and some time constraints. After both Cassandra and Aisha introduce themselves, Aisha will share her story, and this is followed by our conversation about AARP. And then the last part of the episode will be Cassandra's story, which you won't want to miss. I think you'll find today's conversation to be both interesting and surprising. It's great to have both of you on the show today, and I would love if you would each introduce yourself one at a time and tell my audience who you are. Aisha, you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Bonner-Cozad. I'm a researcher at AARP in our research department, and I'm happy to be here.
Cassandra?
Hi, everybody. My name is Cassandra Contave. I also am a senior research advisor at AARP, and thank you for having us.
Many of my listeners are going to be really surprised to hear that AARP is a very important ally for LGBT elders. But before we talk about that, I wanted to give both of you a chance to share your story. Aisha, would you be willing to go first?
Sure. So I think I've always been a very open-minded person. I was raised by open-minded people. My mom's a marriage and family therapist. My dad's a educator. And I guess it wasn't a surprise to me or anyone else that in my late 20s, early 30s, when I had come back to the Virginia area, I met a group of people who were my own age, who were of a myriad of orientations. It was a very organic thing. I was divorced and I was getting back out into socializing with other adults. And I came into this group of very open and diverse people and just had sort of a realization that these really are my people, and not just because I like them, but because I am one of them. For the next 7 or so years, I had a later in life coming out, having experiences dating different people and experimenting as all people do when they find out something new about themselves. I'm happy to say it wasn't traumatic. It was comforting. And I had a very supportive group of people around me. So I think that makes a huge difference. I didn't feel like I had anything to explain to anyone, and people allowed me to figure out where I belonged.
Was there anything that, if you look back on it, you would call a challenge? Because it sounds like your experience was pretty positive.
I think overwhelmingly it was positive. I'll tell you what's a challenge, and it's one of the things that has made me a little hesitant about being super public, because when I remarried a man, and I realized that affords me a lot of privilege that many gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender folk don't have, because they are publicly seen in ways that not everybody in our society is okay with. And so I have this sort of veneer that doesn't place me in a public space when I go out with my family. So for me, that's been a challenge, because I feel like I want to say, hey, I'm queer, I belong, I get it, I understand, but I sometimes feel like the fact that it's not like I'm African American, so people see that immediately when they see me, and all of the judgments for good or for bad that come with it. They don't see my queerness when they see me out with my family. So that has actually been a real struggle for me, how to maintain those allegiances and to advocate, even though I may not look like it from the outside.
Right. I really appreciate you being willing to be out there about this with my audience, because I think there are people who are struggling, who think there's only one way to do it. And so when people like you, and I've had at least one other guest who stayed in her marriage for many years, that doesn't work for a lot of people, but it doesn't mean that it can't work. And especially doesn't mean there's one size fits all for how to deal with being queer. How did your life experience affect you ending up at AARP? Are they connected in any way?
Only very generally, at the sense when I was having this awakening for myself in this personal realm, I was also having an awakening in my career. I was in my doctoral program, and I was assigned to work with a professor who was a gerontologist. And that had never been my interest. I was always going to be a marriage and family type social worker, but I had an opportunity to work with this professor who was engaged in a project in DC. They had a grant from the federal government in cooperation with several other entities, and it was a senior housing facility that was being renovated. And they were putting in a doctor's office and a social worker's office and computer library. So the senior housing was being renovated and then being staffed with all sorts of services in-house, which was at the time sort of a new idea on this model of senior living. I had an opportunity to do the research there, and it was in itself transformative. I developed an appreciation for the lives of our aging folk and really this desire to help and to figure out how I could bring my skills to bear. So in the course of my doctoral work, I sort of pivoted and ended up minoring in gerontology and public policy. And that's where I've been ever since. Around the same time, I started working at AARP as an intern and never left.
So everybody that I talk to, that I tell them about AARP's role, they're always very surprised. I mean, I've been trying to get people to just go to aarp.org/pride. I was at an event this weekend that I was, telling people, and they were just like, really? Perhaps before you tell us what AARP is doing right this minute, if you are able, could you give us some background about how we came to where we are now?
So AARP has actually been working in the LGBT space for quite some time. Initially, I think what most people would have seen at the local level is our work showing up at Pride events. However, AARP has definitely moved beyond Pride to really position itself to show that we're an ally to the LGBTQ community. The point where we really shifted and started to proactively move beyond just showing up at Pride was, one, in hiring our national LGBTQ senior advisor, Dr. Corte. And then two, every few years we do a member opinion survey, which is our largest survey of members to really gauge their opinions and things of that nature. And in 2016, we asked a sexual orientation, gender identity question. And from that, I think we were all really amazed at how many of our members identify as LGBTQ. We estimate it to be about 900,000. And so we knew as an organization that we needed to really come and figure out, how do we best advocate for our LGBTQ members? From there, we've been rolling along and partnering with organizations like SAGE so that we can be effective in the space.
So was it that a member survey in 2016 that led to that later survey, the one that, talks about 75% of people worried about housing and healthcare access?
Yes, absolutely. So that study was conducted by mine and Aisha's colleague, Angela Houghton, and Dr. Corte, Dr. Nicolai. And yes, so that was our landmark study that really delved deep, and it was specifically of LGBTQ people that are 45 plus, so we could really begin to get a better understanding. And also, it helps the organization position itself in terms of not just our advocacy work, but also services and resources, because we know that in the LGBTQ community, our experiences are different. It can't be a one size fits all. And so we have to tailor what we're doing.
I'm obviously going to link to that study in my show notes, but perhaps you could give us an overview. And I'm especially interested in knowing, were the results a surprise? I mean, were people expecting the results? Or if so, what elements were surprising?
I don't think the results were surprising. As an organization, we were just very proud to have such an gender expansive reach. and being able to look at all of these different areas and get some hardcore data, because as researchers, Aisha and I know that finding data on older LGBT is difficult. You know, you've got a lot of organizations that are doing good work, Pew and Williams Institute and SAGE, but to actually get data and responses from the voice of the respondents, you know, is very meaningful. And we feel like, you know, this is a stepping stone to the work that we're doing. You know, Aisha, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the social isolation work. Aisha and I just presented at the Creating Change conference where we discussed some of the research on social isolation.
Before that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Maintaining Dignity study, just some of the points. I'll say for myself personally, in terms of the results, I don't know if they were surprising. I think I was saddened by some of the results. So 50% of older LGBT adults are just somewhat optimistic that the problems they face will be solved in the next 20 to 30 years. That's one point that I was very hard hitting about how difficult it is to get older in our society as an LGBT member. 3/4 are concerned about having adequate family or social support. That's a huge number. And to have those fears as you're moving into a period of life that already has its own set of transitions, that can be difficult to cope with. It's what you see in a lot of minority groups where the typical problems of that stage of development are compounded by being a minority, by being a woman, by being gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. I mean, it's sort of the compounding of these various, what we call socio-demographic markers that makes me concerned about how we're aging as a society. 34% of LGBT adults, the survey found, were concerned that they're going to have to hide their identity to access housing as they age.
That statistic right there is something that, you know, was very compelling to me, because even before we did this study, I heard of this documentary, Gen Silent, where some older LGBT folks that were in nursing homes stated that they went back in the closet for fear of how they would be treated if their identity was known. And I think the other surprising thing that most people would say about the Maintaining Dignity is that LGBT folks live in all types of communities. So we're not just concentrated in suburban areas or in urban areas, but across the different areas, big cities, towns, suburbs, or rural. It's pretty even.
So I know the first time I read that information, I guess I learned about it through the writings of Lauren Olson is what made me aware of it. And then, of course, I went to the AARP website and saw the other more details. But it was like something I just hadn't thought about. I mean, I thought about, as a person who's never had any kids, I've thought about that problem even without coming out as LGBT, the problem of having no family. But like you say, it's all magnified. So you want to talk some more about the social isolation and afterwards move toward maybe what we can do about it?
Aside from, you know, an older person that may not have children, but we also know in the community, especially in the African American Black community, sometimes our biological families are not accepting. And so we're left to really fend for ourselves or to surround ourselves with a family of choice. And if we don't have children, then yes, it compounds the issue as we get older in terms of who's going to take care of us. Where's our support system?
I'm going to interrupt here briefly to remind you that if you post a review of Graying Rainbows in iTunes and you send me a screenshot to grayingrainbows@gmail.com, I will send you an Amazon gift card. Also, if you'd like to get episode show notes automatically via email, just visit our website, grayingrainbows.com. spearheading.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Finally, I've just set up an account at patreon.com, which is a major way where people support their favorite podcasts. I'll tell you more about this in the closing remarks. And I guess another element of it is the spiritual, if your faith community rejects you. And that's the thing that most people who don't have family, I guess, rely on, right?
It certainly plays a huge role. And, we're seeing in our current surroundings these arguments within faith communities about what's the right thing to do. So it can put people at a very high risk for social isolation and loneliness. So in 2010, AARP did a study on social isolation, and it was updated in 2018, looking at loneliness and social connections. The key point I would like people to know is that these issues of loneliness and social isolation and social connectedness, these are public health issues. These just aren't emotional issues. There is research that links social isolation and loneliness to health issues, obesity, prolonged isolation. They've estimated is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. We know that they have serious financial implications. I mean, this is a public health issue that we must address. In the updated study, one of the great things is that, again, like in 2016, we did look at LGBT as well. So that was great to collect that data, but just to add to the inclusiveness of the work that we're doing, because it's important to our members. So those people who identify as LGBTQ are 14% more likely to say that they're lonely. And that's factoring out all of the other demographics. So we can see that there is that increased loneliness. We've already shown in the previous Maintaining Dignity study that the compounding of these issues is very dangerous. So I just think it's important that this information is brought to light so that we can use it as we work to craft social policy so that we can protect people who are at risk. And that's really what we're saying, that our LGBTQ communities are at higher risk because of these various issues.
I recently interviewed Cheryl Wayland from SAGE, and I was encouraged by the fact that she told me that they have been getting a pretty good buy-in from faith communities that it is the right thing to do. So, of course, there's always going to be that certain group that's never going to come around, but that's a positive.
You're beginning to see this movement of nonprofits that are building communal housing for older LGBT and creating communities for older LGBT to live in so that they can begin to have social supports, people that look like them, that have shared experience to help combat not only just the isolation issue, but perhaps even some of the discrimination.
I'm looking forward to interviewing Dr. Amani Woody about that.
Yeah, she's doing great work.
So what's next?
Oh, boy.
I mean, I'm actually amazed to realize that AARP has these people working full-time in research. I mean, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so like I said, Dr. Nicolai Corte, he is our national LGBT advisor. He works to create the strategy on the national level. I know he is working in partnership with a lot of different organizations. In the research department, Aisha and I, we work to get out to different conferences and to different events to showcase the work that AARP is doing in the community. We are going to continue to move forward and delve deeper into some of these issues. You know, we know that maintaining dignity is still very, very relevant, and people are still using that research. And we're just going to continue to show up as an advocate and an ally and a trusted friend to those in the LGBT community. The awesome thing is that there are people within the organization that identify as LGBTQ. And so you have these pockets of people that are doing work inside the organization as well, whether it is educating other people or saying, hey, have you considered doing XYZ?
Is there any big question that we still don't have enough data that we need to answer?
I think there are probably a lot of questions that we don't have answers to. I know when we were at Creating Change, we had a conversation with some of the folks from SAGE, and they brought to our attention concerns about the impact on Medicaid for aging LGBT folk who have been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. As those folks are getting older, what's the impact that we're going to be looking at as far as Medicaid insurance? And that was something it hadn't even occurred to me. So I think there are some known questions, but also probably more likely, there are many questions we haven't considered how they're going to impact the community and what do we need to be doing. Maybe that's not a positive thing, but I certainly think we are more aware and that we're working hard to increase our awareness. And as Cassandra was saying, I think one of our main concerns is not just showing up as an ally. Allies are great, but I think what all disenfranchised communities need are advocates. And I think that's where we're trying to take ourselves, is to really show up as advocates for the community.
Absolutely. And another thing, as Aisha was talking about Medicaid, we actually just gained access to the 2015 Transgender in the U.S. study. And so we are delving into some of that data. We just did a poster session at Aging in America, looking at transgender individuals with Medicaid and access to gender affirming care. And there's a lot of work that we still need to do to delve into the data. But, like we said, AARP is really in the infancy stage of doing the research. And so there are a lot of unknowns. And there's a lot of areas of opportunity for the organization.
Do you have a mechanism, like if someone was listening and they're an AARP member, a way of interacting to say, hey, have you thought of?
The best bet is, we have 53 state offices, and every office on the ground has advocacy, associate state directors of advocacy and community outreach, and are working at the local level. And your best bet would be to reach out to your local state office. And they all also do different activities on the ground. Many of them are doing work in the LGBT community, educational work, outreach work. That is probably your best bet. Other than that, you could always reach out to Aisha or myself.
Absolutely.
Well, I think I need to follow up on that local thing. I haven't done that yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people don't know about their ability to reach out to the state office. And we work with them directly as consultants for their research. So for sure, the folks on the ground in the state are amazing. And they do an amazing amount of work. I mean, it's hard to even fathom sometimes. And they love hearing from their constituents.
And Ginger, you have an awesome, awesome team where you live. Definitely reach out to them.
I will. I want to do a class because they've got those classes on things like how to do computers, and they need to have one on how to listen to podcasts so that I'll be able to reach more people.
There you go.
You
Absolutely.
to them.
So, okay. Well, Aisha, do you have anything else you'd like to share? I'm going to let you log off if you want to, but if you have anything else you'd like to share, I'd love to hear it. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that we could get this together. No, I just want to say I'm really proud at AARP for moving forward. I think it's hard for public institutions to change. Doing that is not only good for us as an organization, but I think it's good as a model to say, hey, listen, you can bring people under your fold. It doesn't mean that the world is ending. Change can be positive and change can make us all better. I'm proud to work for an organization that is open to change and to following that up with something meaningful. Asking the questions is great, but to then say, no, we owe something to our group, to our members, and our members are LGBTQ members.
Well, thanks again, Aisha. I hope I will get to see you in person again soon. Okay, Cassandra, do you want to tell us your story?
Sure. So I definitely came out later in life, like very recently, probably within the last year, all the way out. So I grew up and had a very heterosexual, heteronormative life. I was married and divorced, and really it wasn't until post-divorce that I began to reflect on my life. And by this time I was right around 40. I guess this is when they say that you have like a midlife crisis, which I don't believe it was. I believe that it was awakening. I began to really delve into my past and my history and trying to become more of myself. And through that journey, it led me to the realization that this attraction that I had to women was not a fluke, that this was just really a part of my history. But because I had been stifled as a child and I didn't have the room to really experience or talk about sexuality, I believed that I had to follow this path that was laid before me. And so, like I said, through my work, and I worked with a very good friend of mine who's a coach, Dr. Ikaranda. She really helped me to navigate coming into my own in terms of my identity. So that's how I came to be.
So you were doing research in this area as an ally to begin with.
To begin with, yes, because I've always been, like Aisha, very open-minded, very accepting and affirming. But I think there was part of me that was also intrigued. And so I was doing the work. And even as I was coming into my own in terms of self-discovery, I wasn't clear enough to be able to come out. So I was doing the work and I was being an advocate and an ally. And now I feel like I could just do the work in a more authentic manner.
So how long, do you mind me asking, would you say the process?
Of my coming?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it's ongoing, but I mean, to get to where you are now.
My journey has been about 7 years. And it is because I had a lot of childhood trauma that I had to kind of clean up and dig through in order for me to finally, and so my coming out was really the last step of my healing process and my coming to being the woman that I am. And so I had to get clear on a lot of other issues to finally come out and say, no, you know what? I am a queer Black woman, unapologetically.
So you and Aisha are actually the first Black women that I've had on the show, and I realize that your experience is going to be very different from mine. I mean, a lot of white women that are in this situation are looking at giving up a certain privilege, and I realize that's something that a woman of color doesn't necessarily enjoy.
Absolutely not. I have not run into very many African-American women who unapologetically say, hey, this is who I am. I'm a queer woman. And you know what? And I know the term queer also rubs some people from the older generation the wrong way, because I know there's a historic component and context to it. So I just want to apologize to anybody that word may offend, but that's the way that I choose to identify. Yeah, so I think because there are so many strikes against us as African Americans, it is very difficult to now add on something else for society to discriminate against you on, or to now try to diminish you as a human being. I too am afforded a privilege of working for an organization that's very affirming. Even my coming out at work was met with a lot of applause. People were very accepting.
So what do you think your biggest challenge was? It your past?
Yes. You often have a lot of people that say, well, you were married. Did you know the whole time? Why did you get married if you knew that you were queer? And to them, I say, when I got married, this was my life. I was attracted to my ex-husband and we lived this life. And my understanding and my accepting who I wasn't revealed until post-marriage, when I really started doing my heart work, my internal work.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between the experience of men and women here, because it seems like a lot of men sort of know from an early age, whereas most of us as women, we didn't. It seems pretty rare that someone as a woman goes into a marriage going, I know I'm really a lesbian, but I'm just going to get married anyway. I mean, I know it happens, but it's not the norm.
I agree. And I think for women, because we are so affectionate and nurturing, and I don't know if perhaps we're also more sexually fluid.
And socialized.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think maybe that plays a part. And like I said, for me, it wasn't until post-divorce when I got more clarity about who I was. There's something to be said with getting older and you begin to really define who you are rather than who you were told you should be. There's a lot of clarity that comes from that, from aging, and you start to learn to live life on your terms.
If you were talking to another woman of color or even a black man, I don't really know if I have any black male listeners, to be perfectly honest. I hope I will, that they're struggling with the coming out. Do you think there's anything you've learned that you would feel like it would be valuable to share?
You really have to be honest with yourself. You really have to delve deep and consider, is this just an attraction or is this something more? It's not easy as an African-American woman to come out and say, oh, yes, I'm African-American, but I'm also queer. I also identify as LGBTQ, because there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of issues around safety, family, spirituality. So there's all of these other compounding issues that you really have to deal with. But coming out at work was the last piece of the puzzle. And for me, I feel completely and totally liberated. Now that I could just be my authentic self, people don't have to wonder, is she not? She was married. Now she's not, what's going on? It's definitely very freeing and liberating. Surround yourself with like-minded people. Build a support system of like-minded people, and they will help you navigate your journey. I became really good friends with somebody that held me accountable. Like I said, she's a coach and she coaches LGBT folks primarily, not specifically. She really helped me to be able to stand on my own 2 feet and be unapologetically Cassandra.
And that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to share, either about yourself or about your work at AARP?
Like Aisha mentioned, I'm very proud of the work that we do. Our leadership is phenomenal in terms of how the organization is run, their policies of inclusion and diversity. If something is wrong, they correct it immediately. I'm proud of the work that Dr. Nicolai is doing to really tailor our work, our outreach, our advocacy for LGBTQ folks. I want older people to know that AARP, we're doing this work and we're really working to do it correctly. If you have questions or comments, definitely reach out to your local state office, reach out to Aisha or myself, and we're just going to continue moving forward to advocate.
I look forward to doing that together.
Absolutely. And I'm so thankful that we actually met at the Creating Change conference, and we were able to connect and we could support your work. And of course, you support AARP. And so I'm thankful.
Thanks again for taking the time to talk with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank Cassandra and Aisha again for taking the time to share their work with us. I was really surprised to learn that there are nearly 1 million LGBT plus members of AARP, and I really encourage you to visit aarp.org/pride to learn more about how AARP is serving our community. We should never underestimate the power of having this organization on our side. And it's really exciting to realize that they are moving from allies to advocates. Don't forget that in the show notes at greenrainbows.com, you will find links to everything we talked about today, including the Maintaining Dignity study. And if you want to learn more about the issue of social isolation, I think it was really a major theme that we know is a public health issue, so one to become knowledgeable about. And I really want to encourage you to reach out to your state AARP chapter. I'm looking forward to meeting with somebody from the Alabama chapter probably in the next few weeks. Of course, I want to know what you think about this episode. Just write to me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or post your comments on our website, grayingrainbows.com. You can also post voicemail at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. You can also post comments on our Facebook fan page. And I want to mention something about the private Facebook group. Recently, I've gotten several requests to join this group where the person has not answered the questions that go with the request. These questions aren't there to be invasive. They are there to make sure that we keep the group safe for everyone. But I do hope that more of you will be able to join. Okay, so what else is new? One thing is that I have set up a Patreon account, which will allow you to make donations to help support Graying Rainbows. Your support would be basically going to help pay for website hosting, maintenance, and especially for the person that I pay to edit all the episodes. So it's basically just for the expenses of creating the show. There'll be a link to that in the show notes, but if you're already using Patreon, then you'll just want to go in and search for Graying Rainbows. The other new thing that I've got just starting out is a newsletter, which will make it possible for you to get show notes automatically in the form of email. And the way you get this is, again, to go to the website and just look for the button for the newsletter, and you can sign up for that. I've been doing newsletters for my other podcasts for years, and I know that there's lots of people who find this helpful. Last, the thing I really want to tell you about is something that's actually not going to start just yet, but I want to give you a heads up. There's been a couple of people on the show who work as coaches or counselors for people who are coming out. And I've decided that I am going to become a certified life coach and concentrate on life transitions, which includes coming out. And I'm in the midst of my training for this now. And I anticipate that I will start accepting clients probably in November or December of 2019. So if you're interested, drop me an email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or go to grayingrainbows.com/coaching. And there'll be a form you can fill out there to get on the waiting list. So all I'm doing right now is making a list of people who might be interested for the future. Because when I actually get ready to do it, it's going to be a fairly small number of clients, and the people who sign up first will get first shot at the slots. grayingrainbows.com/coaching. We'll be back with another episode of Grain Rainbows in a couple of weeks. But in the meantime, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Thanks again for listening. Grain Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.